operates the world. Over my dead body, over my dead body, over my dead body, over mine. They have all the money, we have the will, and I would rather be a match than a paper dollar bill. Yes, I would any day. Yes, I would. They have the guns, all we are is flesh and blood, but we will multiply our numbers.
Also, just a background on how this event came to be. When the Idle No More movement began, Solidarity Halifax was really happy to lend support and attend events, and through that we're engaged in dialogue with the local Idle No More organizers and came to understand the need for public education. So the aim of this event is public education, to kind of give everyone an overview of the context for the struggle and what the movement is about locally and nationally. Also, most importantly, I guess, or most importantly, often at this type of event there is a question and answer period. We met to discuss this, and we have decided that the evening is quite packed with a lot of important information from people directly involved in the issues. So while we certainly don't expect that you might agree with everything that is being said or that your questions are necessarily answered, we feel that in a group this size and with the amount of time that we have, that the questions wouldn't necessarily kind of serve the whole. So we really encourage folks to stick around, chat with people afterwards. Also, I'm going to give you a little update on events after we have our speakers, and so we encourage you to do that, to check out the internet. But there's lots of information outside about what's going on, and also if our speakers are willing to hang around to approach them. So just to be really clear, there will be no question and answer period. So without further ado, I'd really like to introduce our first speakers, Rachelle, McKay, and Rebecca Moore. They are youth from the Idle No More movement. So I'd like to welcome you both back.
First of all, I'd like to say that I'm so happy to see so many people here tonight. It's really amazing. My name is Rachelle McKay, and I'm a student here at Dalhousie University, and I am Anishinaabe from Little Saskatchewan First Nation, and I'm honored to be speaking here on behalf of Idle No More. And when I was handing out flyers for this event this week, trying to convince all of you to come here tonight, I was really amazed by how many people had not heard of Idle No More and didn't know what it was about, and didn't know of the conservative legislation that Idle No More opposes. So I think that's really where we have to start tonight. Idle No More is a grassroots movement that began with 4 young Aboriginal women in Saskatchewan who felt the need to inform the general public of Omnibus Budget Bill C-45. An omnibus just means that it covers a multitude of amendments to a number of acts and legislations currently set in place. Bill C-45 was pushed through Parliament without the process of consulting First Nations people and the general Canadian public. This broke an amendment to the Canadian Constitution where the government was ordered to consult with its First Nations people when matters of land, rights, and water were at stake. The future of our lands and waters in Canada were put solely into the hands of Indian Affairs Minister John Duncan, who supposedly had consulted with First Nations before the tabling of this monstrous bill. Bill C-45, I believe, is a direct attack on First Nations land and the bodies of water that we share across this country. And it's not just an Aboriginal issue. It is an issue that all Canadian citizens should be really concerned about, for not just yourselves, but the future generations to come. The government is not concerned about protecting and preserving lakes and rivers across Canada. Bill C-45 allows mining for pipelines and hydrofracking to become a free-for-all on those opened up waterways. When did we say it was okay for Canada's natural resources to be offered up to the highest bidder. The treaties protected those waterways for hundreds of years, but under the new legislation, foreign investors are going to be able to come in and destroy Canada's lakes, rivers, and natural environments. I have two younger sisters who have been raised traditional Anishinaabe. They hunt, they fish, they grow vegetables for sustenance. They don't go to grocery stores. They are powwow dancers, and they are grandmothers in the Sundance ceremony that my father dances in. My greatest fear is that they will no longer be able to live off the land as they do now, and that their children will not have the same natural resources that they have been able to live off of and to find spirituality within. What is a Canada without beautiful waters, without vast green forests and clear blue skies? It is not a Canada that I want those two little girls to grow up in, and it is not a Canada that I want for the future of all Canadian children. Idle No More calls upon people from all across Canada, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, to join in a revolution which honors and fulfills Indigenous sovereignty, which protects the lands and waters for future Canadians. First Nations people are the fastest growing population in this country and the only Canadians with a constitutional right to these lands and these waters. And that's why First Nations people are the most likely group of people to save the Canadian environment. But we can't. But we cannot do this alone. We need solidarity from Canadians who are concerned about what is happening in the legislature, concerned about the bills that are being passed, and what that is going to do to our future generations. We must first of all recognize and acknowledge that it is the land that binds us and connects us all. The land is the foundation for all life, and we owe all of our existence to the earth. The land is what sustains us. Just as important are the other elements that sustain us. Water is the passage for all life and must be taken care of. The air reminds us of our sacred responsibility in taking care of plant life. In our ceremonies, the sacred fire is an entrance for the spirit. This awakening that we are seeing around the world is the people's demand for change. This change begins with changing the way we have treated the earth and changing how we have been living, not following the natural laws that truly reflect sharing and respect for all life. Our government has chosen profits over their First Nations people, over the land, and over our water. And as an Anishinaabe and a Canadian, I will be idle no more.
Okay, I'm more comfortable this way. My name is Rebecca Moore. I'm from Pictou Landing First Nations, but I've always lived in Halifax. I've been involved with the urban Aboriginal community of Halifax for many years. Down the Friendship Center, they have an awesome youth program that I've been a part of for a long time. I'm going to tell you a bit about my involvement in Idle No More and a bit about what it means to me and why treaties are important to me. And anyhow, so when I first heard of Bill C-45 and what it was doing to us, not just as First Nations, which was offensive, them taking our rights away without consultation, without any words, just, it was like one day I found out that my treaty rights are being taken away. That's exactly what it was. And I was always so proud of those treaty rights because here in Nova Scotia, in Halifax, Mi'kmaq, we celebrate Treaty Day every year, October 1st, and that's the first peace treaty between the British, the Crown, and the Mi'kmaq people. And that treaty was signed by my great, I don't know how many greats, grandfather, Jean-Baptiste Cook. And so I'm a direct descendant of him. And I was always so proud of that. And, you know, I would practice my treaty rights. I would go bending down the waterfront, because part of my treaty rights allowed me to go down there and sell. I used to do henna work, and I make jewelry, and I could go down there and sell my things without having a vending license, for example. So that's the treaty rights that I would practice every summer, and that was like good extra money in my pocket for me. So it was a bit of way of life. You know, I stocked my fridge with my treaty rights, so to speak, like for a couple years there, and sometimes. And so when I found out that my treaty rights were getting taken away, that was really personal. And there's no way that I'm just gonna stand by and let that happen and be idle, you know? So there was a rally here in Halifax. I forget what the exact date was. A bunch of friends of mine and I got together, and we had this amazing rally. I'm not sure, I bet a lot of you were there. That was one of the best rallies. Like we do the same march for Treaty Day, but it even had more spirit than that, because we were defending those very treaties that we celebrate. We marched down the same route from St. Mary's Basilica down to Parade Square drumming, and I don't think I've ever heard us drum and sing that loud before, not even on Treaty Day. And it's because everybody knew how important this was. And so after that, there was a rally on Parliament Hill, and I wanted to be there and ensure Mi'kmaq presence was there on that hill that day, because there was First Nations people traveling from all over Canada and even from the United States coming up. And it was really, really bad weather, and it was a kind of bad time, December 21st. Holidays were coming up and whatnot, but two of my sisters, Sarah and Courtney, and myself and this woman, she was our driver, her name's Connor. Anyway, we all drove to Ottawa overnight, and we stayed there just for that day, just for that one rally on Parliament Hill. And to feel the energy that was on Parliament Hill, the unity, it was amazing. I really feel like this movement and the Bill C-45, it has awakened us, and I really felt that when I was out there in Ottawa, because I don't feel like all our nations as Aboriginal people and even non-Aboriginal people, I never felt so much like such a strong unity before. Everybody marching together, traveling together, there for the same reasons. Everybody, you know, chanting with their whole hearts into it, and everybody really knowing why they were there, and just everybody there for the same common purpose. It was amazing, and I never really experienced anything like that before. I've been involved with a lot of things, but this is different. This has a really strong urgency to it, this issue, and we all know that Bill C-45 is not something that just affects me and my treaty rights as a First Nations, but it does affect the environment of Canada, and it will affect everybody, because, you know, you guys, non-First Nations people, you have to live off the land too, you know, you have to drink the water too, so will your children, so will mine. And so then after that, we came back from Ottawa, and I met some friends from Saskatchewan, and I stayed in touch with them, and they told me, we were just keeping in touch, and they would tell me what was going on in Saskatchewan, and I would tell them what we're doing here in Nova Scotia. And she told me that they were planning a 4-day fast in solidarity with Teresa Spence. So I thought that sounded like a great idea. I texted Marina, who told Shelley, who made it happen. And there was people fasting in Eskasoni and in Millbrook. We were in Millbrook. And there were people in Ontario fasting, in Saskatchewan, in BC. So there was First Nations people fasting all over the country. at the same time. And fasting, it's not like, I don't want to get it confused with Teresa Spence hunger strike. We were fasting in solidarity with her, but fasting it's more ceremonial, and the main purpose of fasting is it's a self-sacrifice, and you pray those 4 days. So we were living in a teepee out in Millbrook, and we weren't drinking water and we weren't eating for 4 whole days. And we were pretty much, all we were doing while we were awake was keeping the fire going and making prayer ties and praying and praying and praying for 4 whole days. And at the end of it, we had thousands and thousands, of prayer ties that everybody made, and we offered them to the sacred fire after. And that was our offering, those were our prayers. And because we were all praying for our government, we were all praying for Stephen Harper, we were all praying that, he realizes what he's doing. We were praying for Teresa Spence because we all know that she hasn't been well. And so we were praying for her. We were praying for Mother Earth. We were praying for our future generations. We were praying for pretty much the whole world for days. And that was probably the hardest experience of my life. Or one of the most tough and the most rugged. Because, 4 days, no food, no water, and no showering, no nothing, no technology. You're away and you're just praying. And some people were kind of confused as to what we were doing, even in Millbrook. Well, not confused, they knew what we were doing, but people really believed what we were doing when we had a couple signs. It was a very spiritual experience, and I remember we had a lot of visitors coming and going during the 4 days, so that helped the time pass. But on our second day, there were 7 eagles flying above our teepee, 7 of them. And that's extremely rare, and I don't think anybody out there in Millbrook ever seen anything like that before. And if you guys know anything about Mi'kmaq culture, eagles are the most sacred because they fly the highest in the sky, and they go in between worlds and they carry messages from our world to the spirit world. So for 7 of them to be up flying all around us while we were there to pray, doing our fast for 4 days, it really moved us, and it was like it was an omen showing us and telling us that what we're doing is right, that what we were there for was right, that our prayers were being heard, that they're listening. And the number 7 is special because I'm not sure if you guys are aware of the 7th generation prophecies, but that's our generation. That's us right now. That's me. And I think that the 7 eagles was definitely a sign. So now I'm back, and we got done fasting on New Year's Eve. That's when I was done. That's when I came back to Halifax. And I could eat again, everything went back to normal. But I still stay, I help do this mural. I'm here. I'm still going to help spread the word of I Don't Know More and do anything that I can for this I Don't Know More movement. And I will continue to sacrifice everything that I have, really, and all my energy until we get our rights back and until he realizes what he's doing. Because this really is our country, and it's a democracy, not a dictatorship. And I really do believe that he needs to be stopped. And he hears us. We know he does. And we have a loud voice, and I think that we need to keep doing what we're doing and keep applying the pressure, because he can't ignore us. Our movement's gone international, and we need to stay strong and keep going and keep momentum up. Thank you.
Megan Leslie to speak. Megan is the Member of Parliament for Halifax, as well as the NDP Environment Critic. I think she's going to talk It's about the policy implications of Bill C-45.
I have a warning about timing. I think I timed it at 9:30, so it should be okay. Thank you. I'm honored to be here. Thank you. Merci, Dalhousie. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are in Jabukduk, Halifax, historical Mi'kmaq territory. So I want to talk about what Bill C-45 is, what it's done, why has it triggered this movement, what are the laws and policies that are at play here. And I wonder if there is no marker. I was going to use the whiteboard. You have one. Thanks, Erin. So I'll start with a big piece, sort of up high. In 2012, July 2012, thank you, Canada signed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So we have this UN Declaration. It's not law like we know law, where, ooh, you speed, you get a ticket, and then you go to court and there's police. It's not law like that. It's sort of a broad policy statement that we believe in the principles in this document. And the Declaration calls for free, prior, and informed consent, and it recognizes Indigenous peoples' inherent and prior rights to their lands and resources, and respects their legitimate authority to require that third parties, like the federal government, enter into an equal and respectful relationship with them based on the principle of informed consent. So that's sort of the background. This spring, the government, the Conservative government, introduced their budget for 2012. And a budget isn't a piece of legislation. It's a policy. It's saying this is where we're going. This is how we're going to spend our money. This is what direction we're going to go into. So that came down in March of this year. That's 2012, right? Sorry, sometimes I get mixed up. So the budget actually came down. But in order to actually make that budget happen, to realize it or to implement it, you need budget implementation acts, at least one of them. So this spring of 2012, we had C-38, which is the first Budget Implementation Act, the first piece of legislation to actually try and realize the budget. So this spring, we got the BIA, C-38. It was over 400 pages long, and it amended or rewrote over 70 bills. Changes included raising the eligibility of old age security from 65 to 67, changes around EI eligibility. It repealed the Environmental Assessment Act and replaced it with a new act that environmental organizations have unanimously said is dangerous for the environment. And the oil and gas industry has unanimously said is great for their industry. So then this fall, we see C-45. And the reason I'm talking about all of these bills in a row is I actually think we can't talk about C-45 separate from C-38 because they're both enacting this budget. So this is another Budget Implementation Act. C-45 was over 400 pages long, and it amended or repealed about 60 pieces of legislation. Changes were made to the Labour Code, to the Canada Grain Act, scientific research credits, all kinds of different things. So they are both part of the same budget. And the changes in this budget affect all of us, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, status and non-status, citizens or residents. But there are some specific changes in C-45 that have triggered a response in community and that have really fueled the Idle No More movement. The first change is to the Indian Act and the piece that deals with land designations. So the intent here is to allow a simple majority of people voting on a band council resolution to decide if they want to designate land for a particular purpose. And so it usually means leasing it to a business or something similar like that. So before, you needed a double majority. The majority of band members had to vote, and the result had to be a decision that was passed by majority. And this has been changed to just one majority. Maybe not a big deal, right? We did have a small group of economic development advocates speak to the Aboriginal Affairs Standing Committee in Parliament. And there was only one meeting to discuss this change. But they said, you know, this could speed up the pace of business on reserve, and it could be a good thing. The key word being could. But more than one commentator at this committee said that consultation with First Nations was needed. Because that's what the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People calls for, free, prior, and informed consent on any legislative changes that would affect Aboriginal rights. And if you're deciding on land designation changes, this affects right to land, and so you need to have consultation to provide a forum for free, prior, and informed consent about these changes. And that's what's at the heart of the Idle No More concerns. You heard about treaty rights being taken away, treaty rights being changed. Yeah, and they're being changed in a vacuum with no consultation. And this happens after the government promised a year ago at the Crown First Nations gathering that no further changes to the Indian Act would be made without consultation. They went ahead and they did it anyway. And so, regardless of whether you think these changes are good or bad, to implement them without consultation is the real problem here. And it follows this conservative agenda that we're seeing of speeding up the pace of business. Maybe you think that's not a bad thing, but in concert with all these other incredible changes that are in the 400-page bill and the 400-page bill, it's hard not to think that maybe we're actually losing some safeguards here, that maybe they're trying to slip one past us, because they slipped quite a bit past us in those 400 pages. The second piece in C45 revolves around changes to the Navigable Waters Protections Act, now known as the Navigation Protection Act. The name of the act has changed. This is one of the oldest pieces of Canadian legislation. It was actually Sir John A. Macdonald that brought this legislation in. And if you think about it, navigation to our public waterways is significant to our Canadian heritage, especially First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Think about our history. Forestry, fur trade, commerce, all connected by these waterways. And now shipping, fishing, the tourism industry, recreational uses of waterways, they all continue to be important to us as Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. They're important to us both economically and culturally. The first change to the Navigable Waters Act actually came in C38 this spring. Previously, if you were going to engage in a work and it touched something federal, like a navigable water, that would trigger an environmental assessment. So we have these triggers. If you were going to engage in a work that would maybe impact migratory birds, it would trigger an environmental assessment. Those triggers are gone. They have been eliminated. The Navigable Waters Protection Act is no longer a trigger for an environmental assessment. Now there's a list. If you're on the list, you get an assessment, otherwise you're out. So exploratory drilling in the Gulf of St. Lawrence would not require a federal environmental assessment. So, yeah. So these changes were actually in C38, and they were to the Environmental Assessment Act, not to the Navigable Waters Protection Act. But they're related, and this was done without public consultation and without notice. Now, in C45, we have changes to the Navigable Waters Act, where the approval process for the construction of works, like dams or bridges on navigable waters, well, the it's called now the Navigation Protection Act. It no longer prohibits those works. It only prohibits those works on a list of waterways in this schedule: 3 oceans, 97 lakes, and 62 rivers. So that means more than 99% of all rivers and 99.7% of all Canadian lakes are unprotected from changes to navigation. So practically speaking, what does that mean? If somebody's going to build a dam, they don't have to notify the government that they're going to do it, that they're going to interfere with navigation. They don't need Minister of Transport's approval before building something that could impact navigation. And the Minister of Transport has no legislative authority to remove obstacles to navigation on unlisted waters, like sunken vessels or pipelines, or you can think of all the things that could possibly go wrong here. In Nova Scotia, we have one heritage river that's protected, the Shelburne. The Redora Lakes are protected, and the ocean. No one's building a dam across it, but the ocean is protected, and that's it. They've also changed the name, which is important. Navigable Waters Protection Act to the Navigation Act. They're separating the protection of water from the protection of navigation. Think about a pipeline. If it goes over a river, that impacts navigation. So there's a process there. You put that pipeline under the water, it doesn't impact navigation. So there's no process. You can't tell me that a pipeline under a river isn't something that we should be concerned about, and ministers shouldn't have the authority to prevent that from happening. These changes impact all of us, but think about the potential impacts to Aboriginal peoples in Canada who rely on our river systems for navigation and for cultural practices. There is no right to say, no, you can't do that. C38 quickly, going back to C38, and I want to acknowledge Eco-Justice for doing an incredible legal analysis on the Navigable Waters Protection Act and the changes. They did fantastic legal analysis that we really relied on. C38 and the Environmental Assessment Act, quickly, and I'd like to acknowledge the work of Assembly of First Nations and the National Aboriginal Forestry Association. They did really excellent legal analysis on this piece as well. The Environmental Assessment Act now has really incredibly short timelines, like 12 months for an environmental assessment. Sometimes it takes 12 months for a company to get all their paperwork in order, but it doesn't actually have any provision for First Nations consultation, or if that consultation happens, what happens if it falls outside the 12-month timeline? So there are huge concerns around the timelines. There's no mention in the new Environmental Assessment Act of First Nations specific engagement, but just talks generally about public participation. And to facilitate public participation, the government has said they're going to set up an internet site. I don't know that that's going to meet our obligation for First Nations consultation. There are, and the National Energy Board Act, which comes under environmental assessment as well. If you have something to say about a project that might be reviewed by cabinet, you've got 15 days. So that should worry us all, not just Aboriginal Canadians, that should worry us all. But that certainly wouldn't fall within our obligation to do First Nations consultation in a true and robust way when the timeline is 15 days. So I hope that sheds a little bit of light on some of the very specific aspects of these bills, not getting into, of course, old age security or employment insurance or all those other things, but as they relate to treaty rights, Aboriginal rights, and our environment. Thank you.
We will now invite Erin, Wunker, and Tayla Paul to speak. Erin is the coordinator of the Canadian Studies program here at Dal, and Tayla is a local artist, and they're going to speak to us about Tayla's going to speak first, so we're just going to split them up a little bit.
Let's see what you're all looking at here. So I was asked to talk on colonialism for 10 minutes, and I kind of kept quiet for a minute, and then I went home and laughed. And I did a face palm. I think my neighbors could hear. But it's a pretty loaded topic. But we'll try and go over a few things. So basically, the French got here first. They called it New France and drew some fancy maps. Obviously, the Mi'kmaq people already lived here. But they didn't have the fancy maps drawn, so it was declared New France. They didn't have that much funding, not as much as went into it later on, to build out New France. So it kind of ended up being a lot of missionary works, Jesuit priests, a lot of those writings from the Jesuit priests who actually did try to understand the people a little bit more than other colonizers after. Well, they were missionaries more than colonizers. So a lot of these writings actually do inform us about a lot of our history now, which is kind of loaded too. Then France ended up getting more money to finance colonies here. There were the Acadians. Then there was the 7-Year War, the Treaty of Utrecht. None of that we knew anything about, but somehow Britain ended up getting the territories that were claimed as New France. So the Acadians were expelled, and at that point, before that, it was mostly Halifax that was a colony of the British, and a lot of the outlying areas were French. Yeah, things kind of grew from there. There's also the Hudson Bay Company up north, and contact there goes a little bit further. They say generally it's like 300 years for the north, 200 years for the east, and then extending west to 100 years, the past 100 years, as just a general kind of overview. So there came a point when we needed to sign treaties. There was a lot of things going on. The Mi'kmaq were called to a number of, I think, 1,500 at one point in Nova Scotia. When Cornwallis was in as governor here, there was a call. It's still in the books now. You can get $500 for a Mi'kmaq skull. Not very nice, but Harper won't do anything about that because that was signed by the Crown. The Crown won't do anything about that because it's Canada. So that is still in the books. And that's the kind of consideration that it seems has gone on for the past 2 centuries. So, let's see what else we have here. So we have treaties, and the treaties give us the rights to hunt fish, the rights to sustenance, to live off the land, to practice traditional ways, to practice our spiritual ways. Basically, we've never seen any of those treaties realized from the Canadian government. Only in limited ways, very limited ways, minimal ways, and now they're getting minimized even more. So there's just a front to the way they're being interpreted by the Canadian government. To understand this, you kind of have to realize that the Canadian government has always had an interest in assimilation or genocide. You have to understand that. The nations that sign treaties with the Canadian government have territories. The Canadian government does not. It's a colonizing government. So basically it's in the best interest of Canada to make sure that we don't exist. And it's been that way for a long time. And this has been done through isolation, through structural poverty, through different abuses. Like I said, the scalping thing, there was structural economic things put in place where poor people were manipulated into only being able to make money off the scalps of natives, things like that. So it's a pretty brutal history, and we survived. So then there was, in the 1880s, there was the restrictions of any kind of spiritual acts. A lot of ceremonies were made illegal. Different traditions were limited again. And there was the residential schools, the Indian Act. died there, lots of them, like 150,000 or something in Canada. And so if that's not genocide, I don't, I'm misunderstanding the definition. So a lot of people don't understand like some of the history, like Native people weren't allowed off reservations without permission until like the 1950s. It's fairly recent history. So, you know, when people say like, oh, we're all like the same, like no, it's being structurally made so that we're not all the same. It's being planned that way by the Canadian government. Let's see. So the residential schools, the last one, that too is pretty recent history, 1996, I think, 97, 96. So that wasn't really that long ago. And the impact of the residential schools is being said to be generational. Like there is a recovery process that extends for generations. And in my own life, I've had to understand this context because I am impacted as a third-generation residential school victim. So basically in my life, I had a father who was unavailable to me for emotional parenting. This was because he wasn't parented with any kind of emotion, because my grandmother wasn't parented with any kind of emotion. She was raised by nuns in a very strict upbringing that was basically around work, because that was the agenda, was to make us into people that would work for minimum wage jobs so that other people could get better jobs. And that's still going on today. Not enforced quite as much, but it does still happen as a majority. So in my life, and what concerns me about this bill and this legislation, all of it's going through because it's I think there's a list of like 6 or 7 different pieces of legislation. I ended up, the reserve I'm from has environmental damage to their waters. So with parents that weren't emotionally available, with a reserve that I couldn't live on, having been born in Halifax from the residential school, I would be a product of that attempt of assimilation. Basically, I was left with nothing. And when I mean nothing, I mean I felt like I had no access to my reserve land. My parents weren't available to me. Nothing. I was left with nothing. I lived on the streets, I ate garbage, I walked for miles and miles with nowhere to go. And I found spirituality, and that's what got me through. And that's the only thing that I was left with. So when people don't seem concerned about waters, and I've been not able to reintegrate with my community that is on my status card because of pollution to the waters, I find it really hard to swallow. When people tell me it's for economic gain, when people tell me that they can make a bit of money off of it, because I'm thinking that I'm their next generation, that my story is going to be their children. Because my family's been here for 3 generations in Halifax, and I know what it's like to be disconnected from culture, from things that you identify with. From being left with nothing, I was put in a place that was other from society. I wasn't integrated into society. I was put in a place that was other from society. And it was up to me to pick up the pieces. And that's a lot of what culture is right now from colonialism. It's a lot of picking up the pieces. It's a lot of reading and researching to figure out what the hell you're about, because you're not other, you're one of people that's being stripped of culture in a variety of different ways through a variety of different strategies by the Canadian government. So it's my realization that the Canadian government's never represented Aboriginal people. I would challenge anyone to challenge anyone to say otherwise, and then we could talk about it some more. But yeah, there's a lot of facts on here, and there's more. There's a lot of different strategies that have been used. People teach courses on it, and there's a list at the bottom of all the different bills that are impacting our treaty rights. And yeah, about the consent, I saw an excerpt of what Mr. Duncan said about the consent, because when I heard about this going on, I said I didn't consent. I didn't know about it. I wasn't informed. No one spoke on my behalf for me. And my understanding of my treaty rights was that they're my rights, that no one can speak for my rights. No elected representative can call an election and necessarily speak for my rights. Those are my rights. Anyways, so yeah, I found out what Duncan said about the consultation process, which was basically he traveled around and everyone he spoke to was in agreement. But it doesn't state that he spoke to one First Nations person, you know, which could be a lot of guys that just have investments in China. Yes. I don't know what to say about colonialism without really getting into a lot more heavy stuff, and that would take a bit more time. So I'll hand it over to you.
There are a lot of y'all here. You don't see that from facing the other direction. I'm honored to be sharing a podium with so many wise, articulate, caring people. And I'm especially glad to see so many of you who I don't know, who have made the time to come out tonight, so thank you for that. My name is Erin Wunker. I teach in the Department of English here at Dalhousie, and I direct the Canadian Studies program. And I'm pretty thrilled to see so many people that I think are students in the audience. Okay, like Tayla, I have been set with the task of discussing and addressing the history and effects of colonialism in Canada. And though Tayla and I tried really hard to get together, we didn't. But I think actually we probably did connect somehow, because what I have to say to you buttresses nicely, I think, to what she said. I'm going to speak to you from my position as a professor of literature, right? Meaning that I'm going to talk to you about a couple of terms. I'm going to talk about three things: settler colonialism, narrative representation, and unlearning. And Tayla has already started us on the process of unlearning. Additionally, I'm going to suggest to you some of the ways that I see Idle No More modeling and creating collaborative and coalitional space for acknowledging the damaging effects of colonialism, as well as moving forward in productive and generative ways. But I can only start to speak to you about the colonial history and its lasting effects by first acknowledging my own position. I am non-Aboriginal. I have settler colonial ancestry, meaning that I benefited from colonialism long before I understood what that word meant. I'm also speaking to you as someone who's trained as a literary and cultural studies scholar who conducts her teaching and research in the fields of Canadian literary and cultural production, meaning I think about the way that stories circulate. I think about the work that stories do, the way that they can move from stories, subjective accounts, into history, seemingly inscrutable facts, or in the opposite direction, the way that they can move from facts into stories. You've all been given a handout prepared by the good people of Solidarity Halifax that Tayla started to walk us through already. It's a clear and, as they note on the top of it, partial chronology of some of the historical colonial events in this region specifically, beginning with the arrival of Europeans, or what we might refer to more accurately as first contact between the people who lived here and the people who came to live here. What I want to do with the time that I have is not to work through those dates, to acknowledge them, right? But more so to think about the ways that historical events have been narrativized, put into story, and the way that those stories have moved into dominant understandings of Canada's colonial history. So to do that, I'm going to move to those three terms that I mentioned to you. First, I think it's probably useful to understand what settler colonialism means. You may have seen it as a meme on the internet. I'm going to break it down into an actual definition. When I use the term settler colonialism, I'm referring to the particular kind of colonial history that a country like Canada has. At its most basic, colonialism can be defined as a practice of domination, which involves the subjugation of one people to another. There are many different kinds of ways that colonialism is enacted, and Canada was forged predominantly through settler colonialism. Settler colonialism occurs when colonial powers relocate settlers from the home country, France and Britain predominantly, into the colonized lands. These settlers leave their homes permanently, and they tend to act as occupiers. They develop a sense of difference from their home country, sometimes forgetting or losing their awareness of their settler status. I don't always and didn't initially identify or understand that my history was settler colonial, in other words. Indeed, this forgetting or loss of awareness over time is part of the role that narrative plays. Rather than remembering and teaching Canadians about colonial history, narrative gets inverted, distorted, and often the narrative becomes simply and egregiously wrong. A small example. 2009, Prime Minister Stephen Harper told an international audience of G20 members that Canada, and I quote, has no history of colonialism. The second concept I want to introduce is a way of thinking about how settler colonial history has shaped narratives and relationships fundamentally between First Nations peoples and Canadian relationships is the concept of narrative representation, or how stories work. Narrative means story. It's the aestheticized version of an account or events. Narrative representation, and in settler colonial nations, narrative representation in settler colonial nations can represent or function as a tool to facilitate this historical forgetting. Like historical events and statements such as the Prime Minister's disavowal of Canada's colonial history, these circulate as damaging and pernicious narratives. They augment other long-standing narrative representations of Canada, Canadians, First Nations. A couple of examples, right? We see them show up in seemingly innocuous places like beer ads. As my students will groan and know, because I've stated this I think maybe twice in the last 24 hours, narratives of Canada as a vast and empty wilderness do more than convey images of awe-inspiring nature. They also subtly reinforce founding narratives of this land as unpopulated prior to the arrival of Europeans. And this, in turn, serves to justify settler colonial occupation and aggressive assimilation policies that emerge as the Canadian government's official stance towards people, First Nations people. And here's the thing about stereotypes, right? If you're not the one being misrepresented by them, then they don't require you to think or work to understand their history or context or your complicity with them. They translate into simplistic, incorrect, sensationalistic, or misleading narratives. So narrative has long played a role in the formation of Canadian national consciousness, and it's done so in a settler colonial fashion through the willful forgetting of colonial history. Narrative has the power to damage, certainly. And narrative has played a damaging role in Canadian and First Nations relations, understanding of one another's stories, even conversation, right? I firmly maintain that narratives and narrative tropes have power. They have the power to do incredible and long-lasting damage. But that isn't the only role that narratives can or should play. Narratives and the language that constructs them also have incredible power to fight against stereotypes, to address unjust histories and relationships. And so the last term I want to offer you tonight is the concept of unlearning. Unlearning means to acknowledge that something that you thought was true is actually untrue, such as false or partial histories, damaging narrative representations that become dominant discourses and stereotypes. So you have to acknowledge them first, and then you have to actively work to address, acknowledge, and change your understanding of the facts. And settler colonial ancestry people like me, I'm talking to you, right? Because First Nations people know their stories, or are learning them, or are doing the work to learn them. I am part of a population that has been told I have always had a right to be here, and that is simply untrue, right? So we have to acknowledge wow. Unlearning would also require, right, that we non-Aboriginal allies learn to be allies by educating ourselves, not just about settler colonial histories, but also about how we read mainstream narratives. Like, for example, doing the work to find out how financial relationships between the government and First Nations actually work, rather than saying, hey, is that new budget, the audit of Attawakaskat, isn't that damning, right? It would actually mean that we have to unlearn knee-jerk reactions, such as asking where all the government money goes. Unlearning means undertaking hard critical work. It might mean thinking about the timing of the Deloitte Touche audit. It might require understanding that that audit began 5 years before Teresa Spence became chief. Unlearning means that those of us with settler colonial histories need to work very hard indeed to recognize our own complicities in this narrative of nation. So finally, to Idle No More and my relationship to it. In my view, Idle No More is an incredible model for facilitating unlearning, for working together to acknowledge the past, the present, and to work together for an equitable future for all of us living here on Turtle Island. Idle No More is a grassroots movement that invites models of productive unlearning of these damaging narratives. And the Idle No More movement also makes space for and asks that allies acknowledge the power of narrative both to marginalize and divide people and to move forward. In order to move forward into a collaborative relationship built on mutual respect, we need to learn each other's stories and unlearn the dominant discourses of them. We need to value each other's narratives and narrative strategies. And in doing this work, at least on the part of a fourth-generation settler colonial like myself, this requires acknowledging that not only do I have much to learn, I have a hell of a lot to unlearn too. Thanks.
Thank you, Erin. That was awesome. We're now going to invite Billy Lewis to speak. Are you ready? Oh, I didn't need it for Patty. Do you want me to ask Patricia to come first?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so Billy Lewis? So Billy is an Indigenous elder. He has lots of really inspiring things to tell us. Do you want this mic? No, don't give him a mic. Oh yeah.
I'm not going to get that. I won't be able to see it anyway.
Sorry, I put you on the spot.
goes, as she said. I know in the last few days I've been having a heck of a time, because every time I would make some notes like I just did, along would come something else and would completely change whatever the heck I'd written. And to keep up with those clowns in Ottawa is a chore in itself. The moment that you think you've got them, they move the goalposts. And that can be confusing, but if you look at it in the right way, or you go down deep and look at what they're about, then all of a sudden it comes into focus. And if we have our focus as Indigenous grassroots people, and we do what we need to do, then we can change not only ourselves, as was just mentioned, but change the government and the world, because that's where the answer comes from. It doesn't come from on high, it comes from us. So if it's high in spirit, not in government. And so when I was looking at all the things that I wanted to share here today, I realized that we can learn a lot from history. We can learn a lot from what we've done. In fact, I remember my first response to Idle No More. I said, idle? 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 What do they call an idol? I've been at this 40 years. What the hell are they talking about? But then when I realized it was 4 sisters in Saskatoon speaking to their young constituency, the whatever society, that they were speaking to a constituency that they wanted to get up off their butts. And so I'm not the last speaker here. Patty still has to come up. But what I want to address is not just that history, which I would suggest that everyone go home, dig into well, for one, go to the Idle No More site, and you'll see there, I think it was there, or God knows, I'm not too computer savvy. I keep getting all this stuff and don't remember where I got it from. But there was a thing with Russ Dybel wrote a whole big, long thing, because he's a policy person. He used to be with the Brotherhood, and then later with the AFN as a policy person. And he gave the whole history from Chrétien's white paper right up to today, and the relationship between Indigenous people and the Crown. And there's so much to learn there. And as well, I read something else I saw a book out there by Gord Hill. In fact, I just picked it up. And I worked with him out west when I worked in the downtown east side in Vancouver. And he speaks about that history as well, and speaks about what should be done about it, and speaks about it from the point of view mostly of the leaders, and quite frankly, the misleaders. I think what was missed a bit here is we're talking about colonialism and the effects of that. But one of the effects is what there's a name for it, and it's called neo-colonialism. And that's where our own people are acting and organizing in a manner that reflects the colonial powers' ways of doing things. Like we have ways of doing things, not in a hierarchical, pyramidal way, but in a circle. We got half of a circle here today. But anyway, where we do things in a circle where there's that equality. And that's a different way of organizing. It's a different way of seeing than the way that we have imposed upon us. So when we go away today, I would ask, like I understand there's a couple meetings coming up in the next little while where there'll be further discussion, because it would have been preferable to share some of this stuff today and then all of us sit around and discuss it, but we can't in a crowd this size. But go home and learn the things that were brought up tonight. Keep an eye, watch, because believe me, in the next 2 or 3 days you'll have many opportunities to see how colonialism and neo-colonialism works, because you'll see it right there in Ottawa. Because I'll tell you quite frankly, I don't expect anything except another bunch of promises and another bunch of put-offs to some future date that's going to come out of what's going to happen in the next few days in Ottawa. That's my expectation. And so it's very important that not just Double Farts have been in this for a number of years, but everybody has to get out there and learn the things that we need to learn. In order to learn, as was said, and I remember that one from a long time ago, you have to unlearn. You know, that's an old Sufi teaching, by the way. To unlearn is more important than learning. And so if we can do that together, then, quite frankly, there's more of us than there are them. And I'm struck by the irony. I don't know if anybody else noticed it. I wrote it in my book a couple of days ago. But take a look at what these two bills are called. C-38, C-45, those are guns that are being held at our head. And there's nothing they can do about those guns if all of the idle no more people and all of us surround them. You can't, with a 6-gun, you can't shoot everybody. I don't want to sound like I'm giving the answer, but I think I am. What it's going to take is it's going to take all of us taking a stand. I was just at ceremonies up in St. Mary's here during the summer, and what came out of those ceremonies, it was to bring the Wabanaki Confederacy, all the peoples of the Eastern Doorway, together. And believe it or not, on the last day of those ceremonies, they invited all the allies in. And there were just as many allies showed up as our participants that took part during that whole time. And there was a lot of discussion and a little fumbling and some, well, we better pass a motion and do this and do that. Well, that quickly got squashed. And so what happened is that as a result of that confusion for a while, people kind of summarized and came to something that made so much sense that I think it's true to this day. And what came of it was the necessity. They said, like there was in the old days, in the prairies especially, they used to stick a stake or a spear or something in the ground, tie it to their leg, and stand there with their arms crossed and say, "Here we stand." And that's what we have to do. We have to take that stake, drive it right through colonialism, neo-colonialism, or what have you, and say, "Here we stand. No more. We're not taking any more, and we're not going to appeal to you with a cup in our hand, or I don't want to knock Chief Spence, but to me, you don't appeal to someone that doesn't have a conscience. You stand where you are and say who you are. Then they have to respond."
Next, we're going to thank you, Billy. Thank you very much. We're going to invite Sébastien Labelle to come up. Sébastien is a member of Solidarity Halifax. And
hi, everyone. Before I get started with what I had to say, Megan just slipped me a note just earlier in response to something Erin said earlier. So I'll just read this note. Sébastien, Erin talking about where did all the government funding go? If this is helpful, ... And I think it is because I read the note. Old numbers from 2004. Federal funding to First Nation peoples works out to about $7,200 per person for health, education, roads, etc., etc. If you take the funding for a non-First Nations person in Ottawa, it varies by municipality, it's about $14,900. So about double the funding per person for a non-First Nations person in comparison to First Nations. So that's indicative of the discrepancy and inequality that exists in our society and our relationship. Thank you all for coming. It's great to have such a large crowd here. And we're all gathered here today because of how passionate we feel about this issue, or how interested we are in better understanding it. So first I'd like to explain why Solidarity Halifax supports Idle No More. We support Idle No More because it's an expression of rage. It's an act of defiance, expressed in many ways against yet another example in the Canadian state's long legacy of colonialism, arrogance, and paternalism towards the Indigenous peoples of this land. Idle No More is a rightful stand against the degradation of the territorial rights of Indigenous peoples, against the latest attempt to privatize reserved land in all commonly held territories. And it is also against the latest example in a long history of efforts to force Indigenous peoples to assimilate into a system of private property, wage labor, and profit accumulation. So, many of us are here today gathered because we see common ground in a fight against the Harper government and the Omnibus bills. And this common ground is very important, and it must serve to give us strength and the ability to work towards a common goal. However, there are two things that we need to keep in mind in this effort. First, as Erin alluded to, we have to be careful of blurring out white or settler privilege in our calls for unity. Because while we are all affected, we are affected in different ways and to different extents. The most unifying point of concern with Bills C-45 and C-38 is the removal of legislative protection of our natural environment, and that's no surprise. We all need clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and clean soil out of which to grow our food. But in that analysis, we need to recognize that First Nation and Aboriginal communities will feel the effects much more than others. These communities depend much more than most on the direct use of the natural resources that surround them in order to sustain themselves. Also, polluting extractive industries and waste sites are located much nearer and in much greater numbers to these communities than to other communities. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And that's one thing to keep in mind about this common ground about environmental protection. Another common ground in the Omnibus bill that are found is the opposition to Stephen Harper's disdain for democracy. And however, it's important to consider that while Stephen Harper denies a democratic voice to all of those he claims to represent as Prime Minister of the Canadian state, he outright denies national recognition and rights of sovereignty to the Indigenous peoples of this land, which the Canadian Constitution affirms as per treaties signed. So it's also very important to consider that First Nation and Aboriginal communities have had to endure and suffer through centuries of attempts of genocide, assimilation, and forced poverty. The consequences of this are very apparent in statistics of health indicators, imprisonment, and education. In other words, while we do stand together, the fields of struggle and the stakes before us are uneven. And those of us in a different place with higher privilege need to recognize this, and we need to understand where our advantages come from. It was getting dry, apologies. And I've lost my place in my speech. So we can't say, well, this is a matter of the past. I can't take responsibility for this. On the contrary, we have to take responsibility for this because this is the legacy which continues to shape the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state. And if we refuse to take responsibility, then we cannot hope to fundamentally change the present and find true, honest, and genuine reconciliation, regardless of what happens to Stephen Harper and Bill C-45 and 38 and S6 and S2. So this brings me to my second point that we need to keep in mind when creating common ground, and that is that we need to consider the deeper structures out of which Stephen Harper and Bill C-45 emerge. While we could and should remove Stephen Harper from office and repeal the legislative changes his government has made, and these would be tremendous victories with very concrete positive impacts on the lives of us all. While this could and should happen, it would still not be enough. because we would still be left with a colonial relationship between the indigenous peoples of this country and the Canadian state. And this would still leave us with an economy that's structured to concentrate wealth in the hands of a few, and where the sustainability of a perpetual drive for profit is given priority over the sustainability and health of our natural environment. So let's take a moment to examine very simply how our economy is structured. We need money and resources, first off, to produce something that, through a sale, will allow us to make more money, so that we can then produce more and then acquire more money and more resources. This is the basic cyclic pattern that's always growing and expanding that constitutes the basic structure of our economy, a capitalist economy. So what I'd like to examine more closely in the context of I Don't Know More is where the initial money and resources come from to begin a capitalist cycle. If money and resources are needed to generate an initial production, then where does this initial money and resources come from? Today, if you were to start a business from the ground up, you would tap into banks and investors in order to get your startup capital, because they have accumulated this money and these resources over the course of the existence of our economy. But what about before banks and investors had a chance to accumulate? At the very beginning of the capitalist economy, this money and these resources had to be gotten somehow. And this somehow is through theft and dispossession. In Europe, this happened through the appropriation of land previously commonly managed by peasants. On this continent, this happened through the theft of land and resources previously used and considered a common good by the indigenous peoples here on this continent. So, forward back to today, where levels of production and consumption have grown so much that the levels of accumulated capital, money and resources, are no longer sufficient to keep driving the economy. So that's why we're seeing two things now. One, the increasing dependence on debt and even the sales of debt to keep these cycles going. And two, a whole new round of appropriation of startup capital through the privatization of whatever was not already privatized, including commonly held reserve land. The privatization of this land is in and of itself a goal, to dismantle remaining examples of commonly held land. But what's even more attractive for those seeking capital is that the privatization of this land, along with the removal of environmental protection through bills like C-45 and also free trade agreements, is that it creates the conditions to privatize and transport vast amounts of resources like oil, wood, minerals, and water to be sold for a continued expansion of the economy. These are resources which, whether on or off reserve, indigenous peoples have a claim to. So, if it's the economy that drives the continued erosion of territorial rights of the indigenous peoples on this continent, when we're talking about anti-colonialism, are we not inherently also talking about anti-capitalism? Can they be otherwise than one and the same in the struggle we face today? So, my point of view comes from the fact that I am, and speak on behalf of an organization that is anti-capitalist. Well, what the heck does that mean? That means that we recognize and identify a common root cause for the many forms of oppression, division, and inequality that exists in our society. Because our economy is structured to concentrate ownership and controls of the means to produce goods and services, inevitably inequality in wealth and resources occurs, and fosters divisions among human beings in order to justify inequality. So, this is what we are against. And of course, the question which is thrown at someone who says they are anti-capitalist is, well, what are you for? Well, I can't pretend, and you can't expect of me, a single person or a small organization in Halifax, to devise an entire plan for a new global society. It's very easy to point at capitalism, it's all around us, but to point to something that isn't there yet is much more difficult. And yet, that is not a reason to not try and come together and explore and discuss and experiment building relationships and structures of governance that give true democratic collective power to all those concerned. Without a doubt, there is more to human potential than what we have now and what's been tried already, and we must give ourselves the opportunity to explore and discuss and experiment and come together collectively to find true democratic power. So what we're seeing in Idle No More is a challenge to the status quo. The challenge is expressed in various ways from varying points of view, but there remains a unifying no to the theft and polluting of land for profits that are not distributed evenly. And this challenge is being organized in ways where people are not depending on those claiming to be in charge, but rather taking things into their own hands. Now, as the movement evolves, it's important for us to talk through our differences and ensure that our debates on strategies and analysis are constructive, and that we don't fall prey to pressures of divisive tactics. This struggle, along with many of our other struggles, will create the conditions for us to imagine another world and to create it together. Thank you.
Thank you again, Sébastien. We will now invite Patricia Doyle-Bedwell to speak. Patricia is a lawyer, professor of IES and other subjects here at Dalhousie, and director of the Transition Year Program.
Thank you very much, and I'm really honored to be here tonight. I want to say, first of all, that not kids, I'm sorry, the youth, I love you guys, they're awesome. And I wanted to, my topic tonight, I'm just going to talk for a little bit, is about Aboriginal education. And there's two ways that I look at it. There's, well, actually three. One is my own experience as a Mid-Bac student at Dalhousie. And when I walked in tonight, and I've seen so many people here to support Idle No More, I just was overwhelmed with joy and hope. And the reason I say that is because I remember sitting in the sub 30 years ago, and 5 of us were sitting in the sub, drinking coffee, smoking cigarettes. And it was cool then. And when I think of how far we've come, it amazes me. And so that's the first thing that I thought about. Second thing is Aboriginal education has been one of the major tools of assimilation used by the government. And I've always said, you know, like Duncan Campbell Scott would say that we're going to continue, and he was deputy superintendent of Indian Affairs, we're going to continue residential schools until there's not a single Indian left in the body politic. So education has always been used as a tool of assimilation. Residential schools. And I'm very tied into the issue of education because, first of all, my job, my experience, and the fact that I want to participate in the education of people about the issues that we face as Aboriginal people. I am Mi'kmaq. I am from Doyle-Bedwell in Cape Breton. I'm from Maine. I was one of those migratory Mi'kmaq, and I am the only Mi'kmaq professor at Dalhousie that teaches on Indigenous issues, and the only way I can get to do that is if somebody offers me a job, like a course, to do that. So even at Dalhousie and at most universities, the issues of Aboriginal education, of our history, has not been considered important. And all you have to do is scroll the CBC comments to see how dumb, okay, I said it, dumb people are. We're all in this together. We are all in this together. And on Tuesday, the Federal Court of Canada just increased the number of Aboriginal peoples by almost 700,000. And I thought that was awesome. And I know there's debates about that. But the only way we can have a debate about these issues is if we have an education and we understand where we're coming from. And if what colonialism is about being invisible. I just did this lecture today in my class, so I'm pretty up on it. I have to look at my notes. It's about being invisible. It's about negative stereotypes about us. It's about getting rid of us. And the alternative, colonialism has been opposed by one thing, and that's resistance. And when I think of my ancestors, I think of my mother who went to residential school and still brought us up in a Mi'kmaq way, even though we weren't on the reserve all the time. That's the education that I hang on to. The other thing I have to say is I did an interview for CBC this morning, and they didn't want me to talk about law. And I thought, wait a minute, I get trained in law, I can talk all about law, please let me do it. No, too complicated for the listening audience on CBC. Well, I always thought people listening to CBC were smart. Right? I only started listening to them myself like 15 years ago. I didn't even know. I did, and I like C100. But the thing is that the law is a tool that's been used by the colonizers to define us, to get rid of us, to take away our land, to take away our culture, our ceremonies. And now, what's happening is they're even taking away our right to attend esteemed institutions like Dalhousie University because they don't want to do what they have made the commitment to do, and it's their responsibility to pay for our education. They made that commitment. We didn't say, oh, please give us money. Like I read on the CBC the other day, gimme, gimme, gimme. No, it's not about that. The government made a commitment. We have an Aboriginal right to education, to funding from post-secondary education, and we have to take back our education so it's not simply used as a tool of assimilation. You know what? Assimilation was trumped by racism. Because even if I try to be a cute little lawyer, I'm still an Indian. And I have that Micmac stomach. So I am saying right now, Aboriginal education, the government is trying to transfer the jurisdiction back to the provinces. The Mi'kmaq people have jurisdiction over our own education. There's 2 statutes that say that. They can't change that. And when I say about the law, Constitution Act, Section 52, Supreme Law of Canada, you can't have anything that's in conflict with that, or it's of no force and effect. Hello, Stephen, did you take constitutional law? I don't think so. At least not how it refers to us. So, I think it's really important when we talk about education, I'm going to try to be good and quiet, is that we need education in this environment. I have 3 degrees, and I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying that because it was really hard. It was so hard. Law school, But you know what made it difficult? It wasn't because I had a lack of brain power, it was because of the racism I experienced. That's what made it difficult. And in my job at Dalhousie, I try to mitigate that for people. I try to create a positive environment at Dalhousie. And things have changed. And I'm happy for those changes. So now I'm really rambling. And this is the last thing I want to say. The world was supposed to end on December 21st. My son went to Guatemala and the Mayan elders told him, don't worry about it. It's like, okay, we won't worry about it. The world did end in a way. because something happened. And I think it is the Creator, higher power, God, whatever we want to call that spiritual power that brought people together. And I support that power. I support the people that are involved in this movement. And our education, not only as getting our degrees and getting that part of it, we also deserve to have the education from our elders about our ceremonies. We need our land to do our ceremonies. We need our land to create space for all of us to live in a good way. I deserve to have the knowledge of my elders. I deserve that. And part of what Aboriginal education is about is to teach us how to be good Mi'kmaq men and women. And that is what we're about. So part of being that responsibility, part of having that responsibility is maybe it's getting a degree, maybe it's doing something positive for your community, but it's also about our own Indigenous knowledge and tribal consciousness. And we cannot let that go. And to see the youth moving forward, not just from a political perspective, but from a spiritual foundation, is invigorating and hopeful. So, now, no, thank you. That means to stop. No. We have the right to educate our children. We have the right, if we want to come to Dalhousie, we have the right to do that. The federal government has taken that responsibility for funding us on, and they did it in 1969 when like most people had like grade 3, so it's like, wow, you can go to university. But that's where my transition year program, I call it mine because I feel like it's mine too. That's where that came from. And it's not because we're less than other people, it's because we didn't have the opportunity to get the same kind of mainstream education. So TYP came into being, and we're still there. We're still teaching. It's really about negotiating, what I call negotiating the cultural divide. Because racism still exists. We still face that every day. And like I said on Tuesday, you know, people don't know the difference between a status or non-status Indian, so it doesn't really matter. Because we're all together as Aboriginal people, whether we have a band card or not, because that's the government's definition of who we are. And we have to take the power back, whether it's through, we have to take the power back to define ourselves and who we are and what we need to know and how we work with our elders and listen to our elders. That's our responsibility. And I really believe what someone said earlier, that it might be just our Indigenous knowledge that helps save this world. Because the water is the lifeblood of Mother Earth. We all come from water. When you're in your mother's womb, you are in water. It is basic and fundamental. Those are the things that we have to learn so that we can move forward and take down Stephen Harper, because he's a, as I said on the Big Bang Theory, oh, he's a dictator. Well, why'd you call him that? Well, I just added "ater." The last thing I want to say is I'm teaching a course this semester, and I'm so excited to have my first class today, and I was really nervous, and because it's always scary to talk about colonialism and our history and our treaties and the spiritual foundation of where we come from. But I'm excited because it's an opportunity for me and for other people to learn. And I said, let's go forward. Debate, create, form our truth, find all our truths together. And that, to me, is what our education is about, whether you're doing an MSc in biology, you're doing a law degree, or you're sitting, most importantly, at your elders' side listening when I listened to my telling me the stories. And she didn't even know she was doing it, and I didn't know she was doing it either. Because colonialism would have killed us, except for our strength and our spiritual foundation. So that's what I want to say about education. I can do all the legal stuff if you want, but I don't feel like it right now. We have jurisdiction.
Perhaps just a one-sentence PS. Talking about people defining us, that decision that came down from the Supreme Court says that we can now call ourselves Indians. A little note of history. Columbus got lost. That did not make us Indians. That's where he thought he was going. We are not Indians. We are indigenous peoples. Woo.
Thank you all so very much. Thank you to all of our amazing speakers. I feel like that was a really comprehensive round. Don't leave. There's a couple things I just need to tell you, so important. Tomorrow, 11 a.m. over at the Student Union Building, there's going to be a mass letter writing session in before the rally that's happening at 2 p.m. at the Grand Parade downtown. Monday night, there's going to be a meeting. Not so sure the content of the meeting, but I'm told there's a meeting. And Tuesday night, there's a talk about what it means to be an ally. So if you want to know more about this information,
We have the guns, all we are is flesh and blood, but we will multiply our numbers and drown them in our flood. Yes, we will. Yes, we will. They say they will incorporate the world.